On the morning of October 14th, 1944, two German generals arrived unannounced at a quiet villa in the small town of Herrlingen, nestled in the rolling hills of Baden-Württemberg. They had driven from Berlin, and they carried with them a message from Adolf Hitler himself. The man they had come to see was not under arrest, not yet a prisoner of war, and not even in disgrace by any public measure. He was, in fact, recovering quietly from serious wounds he had sustained 3 months earlier, convalescing at home with his wife Lucie and his 15-year-old son, Manfred. But what those two generals carried into that house on that autumn morning was not a get-well greeting or a medal or even a new command. What they carried was a choice, a simple, brutal, irreversible choice. And the man who received it, Erwin Johannes Rommel, the most celebrated German soldier of the entire Second World War, the legendary Desert Fox, whose name had once made Allied commanders tremble and whose photograph had hung in admiring households across Germany, had approximately 30 minutes to make his decision. By lunchtime, he was dead. His wife and young son watched him drive away in the back of a car, knowing in their hearts they would never see him alive again. Manfred Rommel, just a teenager, stood in the doorway of that villa and watched his father disappear around a bend in the road. And in that moment, something ignited inside the boy that would burn for the next 7 decades. Not hatred, not despair, something far more purposeful and far more dangerous to the regime that had murdered his father. Determination. In this video, we will explore not just the extraordinary life and unjust death of Erwin Rommel, but the remarkable story of what his son Manfred did in the decades that followed. What some have called a quiet campaign of revenge that unfolded not on a battlefield but in city halls, in memorials, in handshakes with former enemies, and in the halls of German democracy itself. So, without further ado, let's start from the very beginning and find out what truly happened to the children of Erwin Rommel after World War II. To understand what Manfred Rommel was avenging, you must first understand what Germany, and indeed the world, lost when Erwin Rommel was silenced. Born on November 15, 1891, in the town of Heidenheim an der Brenz in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Erwin Rommel came from a modest, thoroughly unremarkable background by the standards of German military aristocracy. His father was a schoolteacher who had served briefly in the National Guard, and his mother was the daughter of a local government official. There were no great military dynasties in the Rommel family tree, no generations of Prussian officers stretching back to Frederick the Great, no noble estate or battlefield legend to inherit. What Erwin had was something rarer and more unpredictable, an instinctive, almost preternatural gift for war. As a boy, he was frail and sickly, prone to illness in a way that made his mother worry for his future. He was gentle, mathematically gifted, and showed early talent for engineering. He considered becoming an aircraft designer before his father steered him toward the military. And in 1910, at the age of 19, Erwin Rommel enlisted in the Württemberg 124th Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. Nobody watching him then would have predicted the legend he would become. He was thin, not particularly impressive physically, and he came from the wrong class to expect rapid advancement in the hierarchical German army of the Kaiser's era. But within 4 years, the world would give Erwin Rommel his great laboratory, and he would use it to astonishing effect. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, Lieutenant Rommel threw himself into combat with an energy and inventiveness that marked him as something extraordinary. He fought in France, Romania, and Italy, and in each theatre he displayed the same characteristics that would define his career a generation later: speed, aggression, the willingness to advance far beyond what orders required, and an almost uncanny ability to read terrain and exploit confusion. In the autumn of 1917, in the mountains of northern Italy during the Battle of Caporetto, a then-Captain Rommel led a small force of roughly 600 men on an audacious infiltration of Italian positions that resulted in the capture of over 9,000 enemy soldiers, 43 artillery pieces, and a staggering quantity of war material. For a unit his size to achieve those results was not just remarkable by First World War standards, it was nearly unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. He earned Germany's highest military decoration for valor, the Pour le Mérite, known colloquially as the Blue Max for this action. He was just 26 years old, and already the army knew it had someone unusual on its hands. These early lessons, these insights about infiltration tactics, speed, and psychological disruption of the enemy would form the intellectual foundation of everything he accomplished in the Second World War. What made Rommel different from most great war officers was that he did not simply survive the experience and memorize its lessons mechanically. He thought about it. He wrote about it. In 1937, he published a book called Infantry Greift an, Infantry Attacks, a detailed tactical study drawn from his First World War experiences. It became a bestseller in Germany and was admired by military professionals across Europe. Adolf Hitler read it, and that was how their fateful relationship began. The interwar years were not easy for Rommel or for Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted the German military, and the Weimar Republic was a place of political turbulence, economic catastrophe, and wounded national pride. Rommel remained in the shrunk and humbled Reichswehr, making a steady if unspectacular career as an infantry instructor. He had married Lucie Maria Mollin in November 1916 during a brief leave from the Italian front, and in December 1928 their only child was born, a son they named Manfred. The family lived a quiet, disciplined life shaped by the routines of a career officer. Erwin was devoted to Lucie, and the evidence of his letters suggests a genuine and tender marriage sustained across countless separations. He was also devoted to Manfred, though his career allowed him little time to be the present father he might have wished to be. Little Manfred grew up watching his father from a respectful distance, aware that his father was admired, aware that he was special, but not yet understanding the scale of what that would come to mean. When Hitler rose to power in 1933 and began rebuilding the German military with open contempt for Versailles, Rommel's career entered a new phase. He was assigned to the Hitler Youth Liaison as a senior military officer, a post he found frustrating because of constant clashes with Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Hitler Youth, over questions of authority and training philosophy. But the contact with Hitler brought him to the Führer's direct attention. Hitler had read Infantry Attacks and was impressed. When the Wehrmacht began its expansion, Rommel was promoted steadily, and in August 1939, just as war was imminent, Hitler gave Rommel command of his personal escort battalion, the Führer Begleitkommando. Rommel was at Hitler's side during the conquest of Poland, close enough to observe the Führer in the excitement of victory. He admired what he saw, at least in those early days. He wanted a field command, wanted armour, wanted the front. Hitler gave it to him. In February 1940, Rommel was appointed commander of the 7th Panzer Division, a brand new armoured formation he had never trained with and knew almost nothing about. He spent weeks immersing himself in the technical details of tank warfare before he had even met most of his subordinates. He had no background in armour. None of it mattered. When Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division crossed into Belgium and immediately began performing at a pace that left even other German commanders astonished. Rommel drove his division forward at a speed the doctrine of that era would have considered reckless. He advanced at night when other commanders stopped. He crossed rivers before bridging equipment arrived, improvising as he went. He outran his own supply lines, outran the orders he received from above, and consistently placed himself so far forward that his headquarters lost radio contact with him for hours at a time. His superiors were at various points furious, alarmed, and reluctantly awestruck. The French and British forces opposing him had no concept of how to respond to something moving this fast. His division became known as the Ghost Division because it appeared in places where it had no business being, having travelled through the night across terrain that proper military logic said was impassable. In the 6-week campaign that ended with France's capitulation and the humiliation of Britain's expeditionary force at Dunkirk, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division took 97,000 prisoners, destroyed hundreds of tanks and guns, and did so while suffering fewer casualties than almost any comparable unit in the campaign. It was a performance that made him a household name in Germany, and a figure of fascinated study for Allied planners. But it was only the prologue. In February 1941, Hitler sent Rommel to North Africa to prop up Germany's faltering Italian ally, Benito Mussolini, whose armies had been comprehensively routed by a much smaller British force under General Richard O'Connor. Rommel's mission, as formulated by the German High Command, was explicitly defensive. He was told to stabilize the front, not to attack. He was given 2 divisions, a fraction of the force Germany was committing to other theatres, and he was given strict instructions not to launch any offensive operations until both divisions were fully assembled and ready. He arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941. By March 31st, he had launched his first offensive. He had been in Africa for 47 days. The reasons were simple. Rommel had looked at the terrain, looked at the enemy, assessed the relative positions, and concluded that the British were weak, overstretched, and could be destroyed before they recovered from their own exertions against the Italians. He was right. Within 2 weeks, his forces had pushed the British back across 400 miles of Libyan desert, recaptured virtually all the territory the Italians had lost, and driven the British Empire's desert forces to the brink of collapse. General O'Connor, the man who had beaten the Italians, was taken prisoner. Rommel had achieved in a month what the entire Italian army with vastly superior numbers had failed to achieve in months of fighting. The name that came out of those operations would define his reputation forever: Rommel, the Desert Fox. What made Rommel's campaigns in North Africa so captivating to both sides was the quality he brought to the fight that went beyond mere tactical genius. He was personally brave to a degree that bordered on the irrational. He led from the front in a way that no senior German commander was supposed to do, driving up in his command vehicle under fire, personally directing attacks at the point of maximum danger. His men worshipped him for it. The British respected him in a way that was historically unusual between enemies at war. Winston Churchill himself, speaking before the House of Commons in January 1942, at a moment when Rommel's forces had driven the British back 300 miles, said something extraordinary for a wartime Prime Minister to say about an enemy commander. He called Rommel a great general, a bold and skillful opponent. Churchill was trying to soften the blow of defeat for British public opinion, but the tribute reflected something real. Rommel's adversaries in the desert, men like General Claude Auchinleck and later General Bernard Montgomery, studied him with the intense attention that only genuine respect produces, and Rommel studied them in return. He read their manuals, he captured their vehicles and drove them himself to understand their capabilities. He interrogated their officers personally, not cruelly, but to understand how they thought. The Desert War became in many ways a war of intellects as much as a war of armies, and Rommel was its most compelling protagonist. His peak came in June 1942, after a series of battles of extraordinary complexity in which both sides advanced, retreated, encircled, and evaded in the shifting sands of Libya. Rommel launched an assault on the fortified port of Tobruk that had been holding out against him for more than a year. In a single day, June 21, 1942, his forces broke through the defences and captured the garrison of 33,000 men. It was a stunning blow to British prestige, one that reached Churchill in Washington, where he was meeting with President Roosevelt, and prompted Roosevelt to ask what he could do to help. The symbolic power of the fall of Tobruk resonated across the British Empire. On the same day, Adolf Hitler promoted Erwin Rommel to the rank of General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal. At 50 years old, Rommel became the youngest field marshal in the German army. He was given the baton in the field, in the desert, not in a ceremonial hall in Berlin. He was the most famous soldier in the world, but even at his pinnacle, the seeds of reversal were already germinating. Rommel understood something that Berlin's planners refused to acknowledge. The logistics of the North African campaign were fundamentally untenable. His supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, constantly interdicted by British naval and air power operating from Malta. His forces were receiving a fraction of the fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements they needed to sustain offensive operations. He asked repeatedly, urgently, for more. He was given promises. The promises were not kept. In contrast, the British were receiving a steady and growing stream of American equipment, tanks, guns, and aircraft through the Red Sea as American industrial production hit its stride. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps faced an opponent that had grown not just in quantity, but in the quality of its equipment and the sophistication of its intelligence. The British had cracked the Enigma code. They were reading Rommel's signals traffic. They knew where he would attack before he attacked, what supplies he had, what his intentions were. The intelligence advantage alone did not guarantee British victory, but combined with growing material superiority and the arrival of Bernard Montgomery as commander of the 8th Army in August 1942, it created conditions that Rommel could not overcome, regardless of his tactical genius. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between October 23 and November 4, 1942, ended Rommel's dream of conquering Egypt and reaching the Suez Canal. Montgomery attacked with overwhelming force and meticulous preparation, refusing to be drawn into the mobile battle where Rommel's genius flourished, instead fighting a grinding, methodical engagement that destroyed the German and Italian tank forces through sheer attrition. Rommel himself was in Germany when the battle began, recovering from a serious illness that had plagued him for months. He flew back immediately, but he was flying back to a battle already lost. His forces retreated 1,500 miles across Libya and into Tunisia, fighting rearguard actions the whole way. Even in defeat, he was magnificent, extracting his forces with a skill that earned him the grudging admiration of his pursuers. But Tunisia was the end. In May 1943, with Allied forces closing in from both east and west, and the Luftwaffe and Italian Navy unable to maintain the supply routes, Hitler ordered the Afrika Korps to hold Tunisia to the last man. Rommel, who had flown to Germany to personally argue for evacuation, was not permitted to return. His army of 250,000 men, German and Italian, surrendered in May 1943. It was the second great German catastrophe of the war, coming just months after Stalingrad. Rommel was forbidden to be seen with a losing army. He never returned to Africa. He never saw his men again. The last chapter of Rommel's military career brought him home to Europe, to France, where in the winter of 1943 to 1944 he was appointed to command Army Group B under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, responsible for the Atlantic Wall defences of France and the Low Countries. He threw himself into the work with characteristic energy, touring thousands of miles of coastline, ordering the placement of millions of mines and obstacles, driving his subordinates hard to build a defensive system capable of stopping the Allied invasion he knew was coming. He and Rundstedt disagreed fundamentally about strategy. Rommel believed the Allies must be defeated on the beaches in the first hours of a landing before they could establish a foothold. Rundstedt favoured a defence in depth with mobile reserves held back. History would later vindicate Rommel's instinct, but Hitler sided with neither of them, holding the panzer reserves under his own personal control, meaning they could not be committed without his direct order. When the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler was asleep and no one dared wake him. The reserve panzers sat idle for hours. It was the nightmare Rommel had predicted. Even as he fought desperately to contain the Allied beachhead in Normandy, through June and July 1944, Rommel's relationship with the regime he served was undergoing its final, fatal transformation. The truth about what was happening in the East, the industrial murder of millions of civilians, had been leaking into the consciousness of German officers for years. Rommel had not participated in those crimes. The Afrika Korps had a genuine reputation, carefully maintained, of fighting according to the laws of war. Prisoners were taken and treated properly. Jewish soldiers in the British Army were not handed over to the SS. Civilian populations were not massacred. Whether this reflected Rommel's personal ethics or simply the practical reality of desert warfare conducted far from the SS killing machinery of the occupied East is a question historians continue to debate. What is certain is that by 1944, Rommel was in contact with officers who were plotting against Hitler, men like General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel and Lieutenant Colonel Cäsar von Hoffacker, who served on his staff. He knew something was being planned. He may have been approached directly about leading a post-Hitler government or military. The full extent of his knowledge and involvement remains one of the most contested questions in the historiography of the Third Reich. On July 17, 1944, 3 days before the attempt on Hitler's life at Rastenburg, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British aircraft on a road in Normandy. His driver was killed. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle and suffered grievous head wounds. A fractured skull, damage to his left eye, bruising of the brain. He was evacuated, barely alive, and after initial treatment in France was brought back to Germany to recover. He was in the hospital and then convalescing at home in Herrlingen when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed his briefcase bomb under the table at the Wolf's Lair on July 20, 1944. Hitler survived. The plotters were rounded up, under torture by the Gestapo, several of them named Rommel. The regime faced a dilemma: to try the most celebrated German soldier in the world for treason would be to publicly acknowledge the extent of resistance within the Wehrmacht and to destroy the morale of an army still fighting on multiple fronts. To execute him secretly and attribute his death to his wounds would be neater, less damaging, more manageable. Hitler chose the neater option, and so those two generals arrived at Herrlingen on October 14, 1944. Their names were General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's army personnel chief, and General Ernst Maesel. They carried the offer: take cyanide quietly, receive a state funeral, ensure your family's safety and pension, or face a people's court and almost certain execution with your family suffering the consequences. Erwin Rommel asked for 15 minutes alone with his wife, Lucie. He told her what had been offered. He told her what he knew was coming. He said goodbye. He then told his 15-year-old son, Manfred, the same truth. According to Manfred's later account, his father said quietly, "I shall be dead in a quarter of an hour." He put on his field marshal's greatcoat, picked up his baton, and walked out to the waiting car. 15 minutes later, on a lonely stretch of road a few kilometres from the villa, Erwin Rommel bit down on a cyanide capsule. He was 52 years old. 3 days later, Germany gave him the state funeral Hitler had promised. A solemn ceremony with full military honours, a guard of honour, flags and wreaths and eulogies. Field Marshal von Rundstedt delivered the oration. Hitler sent a telegram of condolence to Lucie Rommel. The official cause of death was listed as brain seizure, complications from his July wounds. Germany was told that its greatest soldier had died of his injuries. The truth would not be officially acknowledged until the war's end. In the front room of that villa in Herrlingen on the morning of October 14, 1944, Manfred Rommel had become, in the space of 15 minutes, something he would never stop being: the son of a murdered man, sworn by the logic of grief to answer for what had been done. He was 15 years old. He had a mother who was grief-stricken and a family name that the regime had turned into a state instrument, a prop for their own legitimacy, even as they murdered the man it belonged to. What would Manfred do with what he had been given? What could a 15-year-old boy do against the enormous machinery of a totalitarian state at war? In that autumn of 1944, with the Reich collapsing on all fronts, there was nothing immediate he could do. He had to wait. And waiting, it turned out, was something Manfred Rommel could do with extraordinary patience and extraordinary purpose. Manfred Johannes Rommel was born on December 24, 1928, in Stuttgart. He grew up knowing he was the son of someone exceptional, someone the whole country admired, and this knowledge shaped him in ways both obvious and subtle. His father was frequently away, deployed on one front or another, present only in letters that arrived in the family's postal box, and in occasional leave that was never quite long enough. What Manfred received from these letters and visits was not just a father's affection, but a father's instruction. Think for yourself. Question authority. Look at problems from unexpected angles. Erwin Rommel was not an ideological man. He was a practical man. A problem solver, a soldier who cared about his troops with genuine feeling. Whatever his early enthusiasm for Hitler's military revival of Germany, the years of fighting for a regime that lied to him about supplies, that squandered his soldiers, that betrayed its own officers, had stripped away whatever illusions he might once have held. His son absorbed some of that disillusionment at close quarters. By the time Manfred was in his early teens, he was already capable of a certain detached skepticism about the regime's propaganda that was unusual in a country where the Hitler Youth drilled absolute loyalty into boys his age. In September 1944, just weeks before his father's death, 17-year-old Manfred had been pressed into service as a Flakhelfer, an anti-aircraft auxiliary, part of a program that drafted boys still too young for full military service into supporting roles. He was stationed near Ulm when he received word that something serious had happened to his father and was allowed to return home. He arrived in Herrlingen to find his father convalescing from his head wounds and already under the shadow of the Gestapo's investigation into the July 20th plot. Father and son spent several weeks together in that autumn, a compressed and intense proximity that neither had often experienced during the war years. According to accounts Manfred later gave in interviews and in his own writings, those weeks were formative in a way he could not fully articulate at the time. He watched his father move through those final days with a quiet dignity that Manfred never forgot. Erwin did not rage, he did not plead, he assessed his situation with the same cool pragmatism he had applied to every military problem in his career, and he reached his conclusion and acted on it. After the funeral, after the state ceremony with its lies and its flowers and Rundstedt's carefully constructed oration, after the telegram from Hitler to the widow, Lucie and Manfred Rommel were left alone in their grief, protected for the moment by the myth of the hero's natural death, living under the constant awareness that the regime knew exactly what it had done. Lucie received the pension that had been promised. The family was not harassed. The bargain was honoured on both sides, the regime maintaining its fiction, the family maintaining their silence. Manfred was too young and too few to fight. He endured the final year of the war in that strange limbo of being the son of Germany's most celebrated general, a general the regime had murdered and was simultaneously celebrating. It required a kind of internal bifurcation that would have broken a lesser character. Instead, it hardened him. In the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces rolled into Germany from east and west, Manfred served briefly with a Volksgrenadier unit, the improvised last-gasp formations cobbled together from boys and old men that Hitler threw into the path of advancing armies. He was not yet 17 when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. He had never fired a shot in anger. He was alive, and he was free, and the regime that had killed his father was gone. What came next was not revenge in the crude sense of violence repaid with violence. It was something more deliberate and more lasting. It was a life consciously dedicated to the proposition that Erwin Rommel's legacy would not be owned or distorted by the people who had murdered him. And in pursuing that project with the patience and intelligence and political skill that turned out to be among the most remarkable qualities of his character, Manfred Rommel would become one of the most significant and quietly influential figures in the political life of post-war Germany. The years immediately after the war were the hardest. Defeat brought occupation, denazification proceedings, food shortages, and the rubble of bombed cities. The Rommel family lived in modest circumstances in the Stuttgart area, stripped of the privileges that had accompanied Erwin's rank and the regime's favour. Lucie Rommel, now a widow in her mid-40s, had to navigate the new authorities with great care. Her husband's fame was a complex inheritance, celebrated by Germans as a war hero, scrutinised by allies seeking to understand how deeply he had been committed to the Nazi cause, and already the subject of a growing debate about where exactly he had stood and what he had known. The denazification proceedings that were applied to virtually every adult in the former Reich required Lucie to account for her husband's history. She and Manfred worked together on the documentation, the correspondence, the testimonies, and the bureaucratic processes that slowly established to the new German state's satisfaction that Erwin Rommel had not been a war criminal, had not participated in crimes against civilians, and had in fact died because he had resisted Hitler, not because he had served him. This was not a simple or straightforward process, and it was not merely a matter of loyalty to a dead father's memory. It required historical accuracy, documentary evidence, and persistent engagement with authorities and journalists and historians who were understandably skeptical of anything that might be construed as rehabilitating the Wehrmacht. Manfred pursued his education with methodical purpose through these difficult years. He studied law at the University of Tübingen, one of Germany's oldest and most distinguished universities, completing his degree and going on to qualify for the bar. He was by all accounts an exceptional student, disciplined, analytical, with the kind of focused intelligence that his father had shown in a completely different arena. Law suited him. It was about evidence, argument, precision, and the public defense of positions that could withstand scrutiny. It was exactly the toolkit he needed for the project he was undertaking, which was both personal and political, to establish the truth about his father and, in doing so, to establish something larger about the possibility of honour within a criminal state. Was it possible to serve a regime and yet maintain personal integrity? Was the Wehrmacht as an institution distinct from the SS and the genocide it carried out? Could a professional soldier be admired for his military gifts while the cause he served is universally condemned? These were not abstract philosophical questions for Manfred Rommel. They were urgent, practical questions about his own father's life and death, and the answers he arrived at would shape the rest of his career. He joined the CDU, the Christlich-Demokratische Union, the Christian Democratic Union, the centre-right party that would dominate West German politics in the post-war decades under Konrad Adenauer. The choice reflected several things simultaneously: a preference for democratic governance rooted in Christian social ethics, a practical political alignment with the party of Adenauer's post-war reconstruction and Western integration, and a conscious rejection of the ideological extremes, both right and left, that had destroyed Germany. Manfred Rommel was not simply a passive member. He was an active, committed politician who rose steadily through the structures of the Stuttgart city administration. He served as a legal official, then as a senior administrator, learning the machinery of municipal government from the inside. He was methodical, he was patient, he was effective. And in 1974, at the age of 45, he was elected Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, one of Germany's most important cities, the capital of Baden-Württemberg and the home of major German industrial enterprises including Daimler-Benz and Porsche. He would serve as Lord Mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years, retiring in 1996 at the age of 67. In that time, he became one of the most prominent and respected local politicians in Germany, known for his administrative competence, his dry wit, his independent voice, and his absolute commitment to democratic values and the rule of law. He was offered positions in national politics more than once and consistently declined them. Stuttgart was his arena, and he used it with great deliberateness. Under his leadership, the city developed a reputation for innovative urban planning, for cultural investment, and for a particular kind of civic seriousness that reflected his own character. But what mattered most to those watching his career closely was what he did with the platform of his office to shape the memory of the Second World War and his father's place in it. Manfred Rommel's most striking act of symbolic politics came not in any speech or book or parliamentary debate, but in a handshake, specifically in a friendship. And the other man in that friendship was David Montgomery, the second Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, the son of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the man who had beaten Erwin Rommel at El Alamein in 1942. Bernard Montgomery and Erwin Rommel had been the two great protagonists of the North African campaign, rivals across the sand, enemies locked in a duel of wills and armies that had captured the imagination of the entire wartime world. Their sons had every reason to be, at minimum, strangers. They chose instead to be friends. Manfred and David Montgomery met in the 1970s and formed a genuine personal bond that they then deliberately made public and symbolic. They appeared together at memorial ceremonies. They spoke together to audiences in both Germany and Britain about reconciliation, about the possibility of former enemies becoming partners in peace, about the responsibility of the children of great men to honour their fathers' memories without perpetuating their wars. The two men stood side by side at El Alamein for commemorations of the battle's anniversary. German and British, sons of opposing commanders, united in the shared conviction that their fathers' genuine respect for each other as soldiers was a foundation on which something real and lasting could be built. This friendship was not merely a touching personal story. In the context of post-war European politics, it was a statement of intent. West Germany's rehabilitation as a democratic partner in the Atlantic Alliance required not just formal political agreements and economic integration, but a cultural renegotiation of what Germany was and had been and could be. The children of the war's protagonists making public gestures of reconciliation was not just symbolism, it was part of the essential social architecture of a new Europe. Manfred Rommel understood this completely, and he played his role in it with total conviction. He was not performing reconciliation, he was living it, and in doing so, he was executing with great skill and patience the project of his lifetime. The demonstration that Germany could be trusted again, that the Germany of democracy and law and civic responsibility was a genuine and permanent inheritance, not a temporary facade, and that the memory of honourable men who had served in a dishonoured cause could be held with clarity and without apology. At the same time, Manfred was engaged in a more direct and sometimes contentious battle for his father's specific historical reputation. The question of whether Rommel was genuinely part of the resistance to Hitler or merely a disillusioned officer who was swept up in events he had not fully chosen was debated by historians throughout the post-war decades. The resistance narrative was important to Germany because it allowed the country to claim at least some of its military heroes as men of conscience, men who had ultimately said no. Rommel's case was complicated by the ambiguity of his actual involvement in the July 20th plot. The documentary evidence of his direct participation was thin. The evidence that he had been in contact with conspirators and that those conspirators believed he was sympathetic was stronger. Whether he had actively agreed to be part of a post-Hitler government or had merely failed to denounce people he knew were planning something illegal was a question without a clean answer. Manfred argued consistently and publicly that his father was a resistor and a victim, that the regime's murder of Erwin Rommel was the ultimate confession of what it had feared from him, that an innocent man is not silenced with poison and a cover story. He was not simply a son defending a father uncritically. He acknowledged the complexity. He acknowledged that his father had served Hitler and benefited from Hitler's patronage and had won his greatest fame in Hitler's service. But he insisted, with the evidence of October 14th, 1944, as his foundation, that Erwin Rommel had ultimately chosen the right side, had paid the ultimate price for that choice, and deserved to be remembered with the honour that choice had earned him. This argument was not universally accepted by historians, and Manfred was willing to engage that disagreement directly and vigorously. He wrote about it, he gave interviews about it, he corresponded with scholars and journalists. He was not trying to suppress the historical debate, he was trying to shape it on the basis of what he genuinely believed to be the truth. The question that historians would wrestle with across the decades and that Manfred wrestled with in public was whether Erwin Rommel could be fully separated from the crime of the regime he served. The answer required looking carefully at what the Afrika Korps had and had not done in North Africa. The historical record on this point was notably different from what it was for most German military formations on other fronts. There is no documented evidence of the Afrika Korps participating in the execution of prisoners, the murder of civilians, or the cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen, of the kind that occurred extensively on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans. British prisoners taken by Rommel's forces were treated, by the overwhelmingly consistent testimony of those prisoners themselves, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Jewish soldiers in the British and South African armies were not identified and handed over. War correspondents from neutral countries were given access and reported their observations. This was not universal German behaviour. It was specific to the Afrika Korps, and it reflected, at minimum, the command culture that Rommel established and enforced. Whether it reflected his personal ethics or his tactical pragmatism, or both, it distinguished him from commanders like Georg von Küchler, whose Army Group North was directly implicated in mass executions in the occupied Soviet Union, and who received a 20-year sentence at the High Command trial in Nuremberg. The contrast between what happened to Rommel's reputation and what happened to the reputations of commanders like Küchler or Wilhelm List, who was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in atrocities in the Balkans, or Wilhelm von Leeb, who received a lenient sentence but was documented to have transmitted the criminal orders that led to mass murder, was not accidental. Rommel's post-war reputation was built on a genuine distinction. He had commanded an army that, whatever else might be said about the political cause it served, had fought with a certain professional honour that his contemporaries had not all matched. His son spent decades making sure that distinction was understood, documented, and remembered. The broader context of Manfred Rommel's career of historical advocacy becomes clearer when you set it against what other children of the Nazi leadership were doing during the same decades. The fates and choices of these children were not uniform. They ranged from fiercely defiant loyalty to the father's legacies, through complicated mixtures of remorse and defensiveness, to outright public rejection of everything their fathers had represented. Each story illuminated something different about the inheritance of evil and the possibilities of escape from it. And understanding those other stories helps to understand what Manfred Rommel's particular path represented and why it was, in its way, so unusual. Consider first Gudrun Himmler. Born on August 8, 1929, just a year after Manfred Rommel, Gudrun was the only child of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the man most directly responsible for the operational machinery of the Holocaust, the overseer of the concentration camp system, the architect of the Einsatzgruppen that murdered Jews, Roma, and others in the occupied East. Himmler had held Gudrun in a special kind of affection during her childhood, flying her to his Berlin offices from Munich, calling her by her childhood nickname Pupi, maintaining daily phone calls when they were apart, sending her weekly letters. She had attended official functions at his side and had visited concentration camps as a child. Whether she understood what she was seeing at the time is disputed. What is not disputed is what she thought of her father after the war. She never abandoned him. When Himmler was captured by British troops in May 1945 and died by his own cyanide capsule, Gudrun refused to accept the official account, insisting instead that he had been assassinated. Both she and her mother were arrested by American forces and held in a series of camps in Italy, France, and Germany. They were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials and were subsequently released in November 1946. What Gudrun did with her freedom stands in stark moral contrast to what Manfred Rommel did with his. Gudrun Himmler became one of the most active and committed members of an organization called Stille Hilfe, or Silent Aid, a secretive network that provided practical support to arrested, condemned and fugitive former SS members. She worked within this organization for decades, helping former perpetrators avoid justice, supporting their legal defenses, and maintaining a community of shared memory that refused to acknowledge the crimes in which the men being supported had participated. She was, by all informed accounts, a central figure in this network, using her father's name and her personal connections to sustain a project of denial and obstruction. She never publicly expressed remorse for what her father had done. She never publicly acknowledged the scale of the Holocaust. She died in 2018 at the age of 88, unreconciled with the truth of her father's crimes and the crimes she had spent her adult life helping to cover. Her story is, in its way, the mirror image of Manfred Rommel's. She too had dedicated her life to her father's memory, but where Manfred had done so by engaging honestly with history's complexity and insisting on the truth as he understood it, Gudrun had done so by dedicating herself to lies, to obstruction, and to the protection of men who had committed some of the worst crimes in human history. The contrast became even sharper when set against the story of Martin Bormann Jr., the eldest son of Martin Bormann, the Nazi Party's powerful secretary and one of Hitler's closest political associates. Martin Bormann Sr. was one of the most influential and least visible figures in the Third Reich, a bureaucratic manipulator who controlled access to Hitler and used that control to build a personal empire of power within the party apparatus. He disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall in May 1945 and was tried in absentia at Nuremberg, sentenced to death for his role in the Holocaust and other crimes. His remains were eventually identified in Berlin in 1972, and forensic examination confirmed he had died during the Berlin fighting. His son Martin Jr., born on April 14, 1930, grew up in the shadow of his father's position, shielded as a child from the full horror of what the regime was doing and what his father was facilitating. He was only a child during the height of his father's power and the worst of the atrocities of the Second World War. After the war, Martin Jr.'s life took a path almost diametrically opposed to his father's. Confronted with the full truth of what had been done in the name of National Socialism and what his father's specific role had been, he did not retreat into denial or defensiveness. Instead, he underwent something more like a genuine conversion. He turned to Catholicism with deep seriousness, becoming not just a nominal Christian but an active missionary, working in the Congo and Cameroon as a teacher and community worker. He devoted his life to service of others in a way that seemed consciously conceived as reparation for his father's crimes. He spoke publicly about his father with a directness and a moral clarity that was almost brutal in its honesty, refusing to search for mitigating circumstances or to offer the explanations that would have made his father's choices more understandable. He was, in the vocabulary of German collective memory, one of the Täterkinder, the perpetrator's children, who chose accountability over denial. His story, too, had its shadows. In 2011, he found himself at the center of abuse allegations from a former student who claimed Bormann had physically abused him in the early 1960s, when the student was 12 years old. There were further accusations of severe physical violence against other children in his care. At the time these allegations surfaced, Martin Jr. was battling dementia, rendering him either unable or unwilling to address them. While these accusations never led to legal action, the independent Klasnik Commission set up to investigate abuses within the Catholic Church in Austria awarded the accuser compensation, a finding that cast a complicated shadow over what had been, for decades, one of post-war Germany's most celebrated stories of personal redemption. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, occupied yet another position on the spectrum of how the children of perpetrators dealt with their inheritance. Hans Frank was one of the most directly culpable figures in the Nazi hierarchy when it came to genocide. He was Hitler's personal lawyer and had served as the Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he oversaw the administration of the territories in which the vast majority of Polish Jews were systematically murdered. He was known as the Butcher of Poland. At Nuremberg, he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was hanged on October 16, 1946. His son, Nicholas, born in 1939, was too young to understand the atrocities as they happened, but his adulthood was consumed by the effort. to understand them, to document them and to confront them in the most public way possible. He wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Reich, which detailed not just his father's crimes, but his own psychological struggle to come to terms with them. He became one of post-war Germany's most vocal and unflinching public figures on the question of Nazi guilt, touring Germany and beyond with a lecture on his father's crimes that he delivered with a directness and a controlled fury that made audiences profoundly uncomfortable. He refused the consolations of historical distance or mitigating circumstance. He said, repeatedly and explicitly, that his father had been a mass murderer, and that Germany needed to continue acknowledging that fact in all its ugliness. His commitment to educating others about the Holocaust and its lasting effects on the families of perpetrators and victims alike added a unique and painful perspective to Holocaust remembrance. Where Gudrun Himmler defended her father and Manfred Rommel made distinctions between his father and the regime, Nicholas Frank burned his father's legacy with the same ferocity that Hans Frank had burned Poland. The story of Edda Goering brought a different kind of silence to the post-war reckoning with inherited guilt. Edda was the only child of Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe commander, the number 2 in the Nazi hierarchy after Hitler himself, the man who had been designated Hitler's successor, the founder of the Gestapo, and a figure whose personal corruption and grotesque vanity had made him one of the most recognizable villains of the era. Hermann Goering had created in his daughter an only child's world of extraordinary privilege. She was born in 1938, and her early years were spent at the family estate of Carenhall in the forests north of Berlin, a vast and fantastically decorated palace filled with looted artworks that Goering had systematically stripped from occupied Europe. She had been gifted precious artworks in her childhood, including a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder. She had been photographed at public events as a symbol of the regime's wholesome family image, a prop for propaganda, though she could not have understood that at the time. As the war neared its end, she and her mother Emmy relocated to their mountain residence near Berchtesgaden, far from the burning cities and the advancing armies. The end of the Second World War brought the Goering family's world crashing down with particular finality. Hermann Goering was captured by American troops, tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, and sentenced to death. He escaped the gallows by obtaining a cyanide capsule and taking his own life the night before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946. His death left Edda fatherless at age 8, and heir to a legacy so tainted that it would define every subsequent year of her life. In the decades of the 1950s and 1960s, the valuable artworks she had been given as a child became embroiled in long legal disputes, most of which she lost. In 1968, final judgment stripped her of the last of the significant pieces. She attempted to live a life away from the public eye, rarely speaking about her father in public, though maintaining in private conversations that he had been a good man. This silence was, in its own way, a kind of preservation. By not speaking publicly, she neither condemned nor exonerated, maintaining an ambiguity that allowed her to continue living without making a definitive public account of herself. During a 1986 television interview in Sweden, she broke this silence to express her deep affection for both her parents, but even that expression was more personal than political, more emotional than historical. She passed away in 2018, leaving behind a life forever defined by the actions of the man who had held her as a child in the halls of Carenhall, while the Luftwaffe bombed European cities and the Gestapo filled its prisons. What is striking about placing Edda, Goering's story, next to Manfred Rommel's is not just the moral contrast, but the contrast of historical inheritance. Goering had been a perpetrator of the First Order, someone directly involved in constructing the apparatus of persecution and murder. Rommel had been a military commander who, by the best available evidence, had kept his army's hands clean. The weight Edda Goering carried into her post-war life was heavier by far than anything Manfred Rommel faced, and she chose silence where he chose engagement. Neither choice was costless. Silence preserved her from the necessity of public reckoning, but denied her the possibility of genuine reconciliation. Engagement forced Manfred to fight the same battle repeatedly, to defend and explain and qualify and distinguish, but it gave him something that silence could not, the capacity to shape how the story was understood, to ensure that his version of his father's truth had a hearing in the public record of history. Perhaps no post-war fate, Among the children of Nazi perpetrators was more psychologically complex than that of Rolf Mengele, the son of Josef Mengele, the SS physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau, who had presided over selection on the arrival ramp, choosing which prisoners would die immediately in the gas chambers and which would live temporarily for forced labour, and who had conducted gruesome and often fatal medical experiments on prisoners, particularly on twins and children. Mengele's specific crimes were among the most viscerally horrifying perpetrated within the concentration camp system, and his post-war escape through the Odessa network to South America made him one of the most hunted war criminals in the world and one of the most enduring symbols of Nazi evil. His son Rolf was born on March 16, 1944, and grew up in Germany while his father was a fugitive in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Rolf's early years were shaped by lies. He was told his father had been a war hero who had died. Only in his early teenage years did he begin to piece together the truth. He went on to study law and worked as a corporate lawyer, building a life in Germany at as great a distance from his father's name as he could manage. In 1977, however, the distance collapsed. Josef Mengele had been writing letters to his son over the years, and those letters had sparked Rolf's curiosity, even as they horrified him. In 1977, Rolf made the journey to South America to meet the father he had never really known. What he found shattered whatever residual illusions his father's letters may have maintained. Josef Mengele showed no remorse for what he had done at Auschwitz. He attempted, in their conversations, to rationalize the experiments, to explain them as scientifically justified, to frame himself as a victim of circumstance and historical misunderstanding, rather than a man who had personally supervised the torture and death of hundreds, if not thousands, of human beings. Rolf listened. He despised what he heard, and despised the man who said it. He felt contempt and grief in equal measure. And yet, in the end, he could not bring himself to betray his father to the Nazi hunters who were looking for him. He kept Mengele's location secret. The man who had been called the Angel of Death, one of the most wanted criminals on earth, died of a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil in 1979. Having never faced justice, his identity confirmed only years later when his remains were exhumed and forensically examined. Rolf Mengele subsequently changed his name and severed all ties with his past. He was reported to be living quietly as a retired attorney somewhere in Germany, a private person in the most profound sense, someone who had chosen invisibility over the alternatives of public condemnation or public defense. His story was one of the most haunting in the entire gallery of the perpetrator's children. A man who knew the truth about his father, despised it, and in the end could not quite escape. The biological imperative that made betrayal impossible. The story of Wolf Rüdiger Hess occupied a different corner of this complicated moral landscape. Rudolf Hess, his father, was one of the strangest figures in the Nazi hierarchy. He had been one of Hitler's oldest companions, a true believer from the earliest days of the movement, who had shared a prison cell with Hitler after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, and had served as his personal secretary and deputy. But in May 1941, in one of the most bizarre acts of the entire war, Rudolf Hess had climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 aircraft and flown solo to Scotland in a private attempt to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. He parachuted into Scotland and was immediately arrested. His mission was unauthorized, delusional, and completely unsuccessful. Hitler, furious and embarrassed, declared Hess mentally ill and struck him from the leadership roles. Hess spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner, was tried at Nuremberg, escaped execution by reason of the divergent views of the Allied prosecutors, and was sentenced instead to life imprisonment in Spandau prison. He remained there, eventually its only prisoner, until 1987, when at the age of 93 he was found dead, apparently having hanged himself with an electrical cord. There were immediately conspiracy theories advanced most vocally by his son Wolf, suggesting that Hess had been murdered by his captors. Wolf Rüdiger Hess was born in November 1937, several years after his father had become one of the most powerful men in Germany. He never really knew his father in any intimate sense. Rudolf Hess was in prison for virtually Wolf's entire childhood and adult life. But far from creating distance between Wolf and his father's memory, this absence had the opposite effect. Wolf became, if anything, more ferociously devoted to his father's defense than Gudrun Himmler was to hers. He spent decades in a campaign to change the public. perception of his father, establishing a committee to free Rudolf Hess that at its peak amassed several 100,000 supporters, including some notable figures in German politics. He authored numerous books advocating for the recognition of Hess as a German hero rather than a criminal, arguing that his father's unauthorized peace mission demonstrated not the delusion of a true believer, but the conscience of a man who wanted to stop the war. Following Hess's death in 1987, Wolf contended loudly and consistently that his father had been murdered by British intelligence rather than dying by suicide, and he continued this campaign until his own death in 2001. He was in many ways Gudrun Himmler's ideological cousin, a child who had converted grief and loss into a lifelong project of denial, advocacy, and historical revisionism that served not truth but loyalty. He never acknowledged the crimes of the regime his father had helped to build, never expressed remorse on his father's behalf, and died still fighting a battle that history had definitively settled. Set against these figures, against Gudrun Himmler's obstruction, Wolf Hess's revisionism, and Edda Goering's protective silence, the path chosen by Albert Speer Jr. stands as a different kind of post-war existence, a deliberate and total separation from the inherited name. Albert Speer Sr. had been Hitler's favourite architect and Germany's armaments minister, a man of extraordinary organisational gifts who had used them to sustain the Nazi war machine through forced labour, extending the conflict by months, if not years, and thereby prolonging the deaths of millions. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, where he served his full sentence before being released in 1966. He emerged from prison as, paradoxically, one of the few high-ranking Nazis who had publicly expressed regret for his participation in the regime, though the sincerity and comprehensiveness of that remorse has been vigorously debated by historians who have found evidence that Speer's claim to have known nothing of the Holocaust was carefully constructed and almost certainly false. His son, Albert Jr., was born on July 29, 1934, in Berlin, just days before Hitler formally became Führer. The young Albert had spent his earliest years in Berchtesgaden, and there are filmed records from the 1930s showing the small boy playing on the porch of Hitler's villa while the dictator watched. Following his father's conviction and imprisonment, the Speer family took refuge with Albert Jr.'s grandparents in Heidelberg. During that period, the boy developed a severe stutter, a response to the stress of his circumstances that he eventually overcame. He trained as a carpenter, then shifted to architecture, becoming in time a successful architect in his own right. That choice of profession invited constant commentary and speculation about whether he was following in his father's footsteps, consciously or unconsciously, and Albert Jr. was adamant in rejecting the suggestion. In an interview with the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung in 2010, he declined to discuss his father at all, stating simply that he had tried his whole life to separate himself from his father, to distance himself from what that name carried. He passed away at his Frankfurt residence at the age of 83, having built a successful professional career in deliberate obscurity, his father's name a burden he had set down as completely as anyone can set down something they were born with. The range of responses among these children, from Gudrun Himmler's fierce and dangerous loyalty to Nicholas Frank's furious public condemnation, from Rolf Mengeler's paralysed silence to Albert Speer Jr.'s deliberate disappearance, defined a kind of spectrum of possibility available to those born into the families of the men who had committed the century's worst crimes. Manfred Rommel's position on that spectrum was, as we have established, complicated by the specific nature of his father's case. A man who had served the regime without participating in its worst crimes, who had been murdered by it, and whose memory could therefore be defended without the same agonizing distortions that defense required when applied to Himmler's daughter, or Goering's daughter, or Hess's son. But even acknowledging that advantage, what Manfred made of his position was not inevitable. He could have chosen Albert Speer Jr.'s path of withdrawal. He could have chosen something quieter and safer than 22 years of high-profile political leadership with his father's shadow always present. He chose engagement, actively, repeatedly, publicly, over the course of his entire adult life. To understand the full significance of what Manfred Rommel accomplished in Stuttgart requires some sense of what Stuttgart itself represented in West German political culture. Stuttgart is the capital of Baden-Württemberg, one of the most economically dynamic states in the Federal Republic, home to internationally renowned industrial enterprises and to some of the most productive and innovative small and medium-sized businesses in Europe. It is a city of serious culture, serious engineering, and serious politics, a place where the quality of civic governance matters enormously to its citizens, and where a long-serving mayor leaves a visible legacy in the physical and social fabric of the city. Manfred Rommel served for 22 years, from 1974 to 1996, and the city he left behind was measurably better than the one he had received. Better planned, better maintained, more internationally connected, more culturally confident, and more firmly rooted in the democratic values he had spent his career advancing. His administrative achievements were substantial. He oversaw major infrastructure developments, the renovation of Stuttgart's historic centre, investments in public transport, and the development of the city's institutions of culture and education. He was known as a practical administrator who cut through bureaucracy and got things done, qualities that recalled, in a very different context, the famous efficiency with which his father had cut through tactical problems in the field. He attracted investment, managed public finances responsibly, and maintained throughout his tenure the reputation for personal integrity that was perhaps his most politically valuable asset. In a post-war Germany that had learned through bitter experience what happens when political leaders are dishonest or corrupted, Manfred Rommel's reputation for saying what he thought, doing what he promised, and maintaining his principles regardless of political pressure was not just personally admirable, it was politically useful. It told voters something they very much needed to believe, that German politics could produce leaders who were genuinely trustworthy, genuinely committed to democratic values, and genuinely free of the compromises and corruptions that had made the Third Reich possible. Beyond the administrative record, what defined Manfred's mayoralty in the eyes of those who watched it closely was the way he used his public platform to engage with Germany's moral reckoning with its own history. He was not a solemn or earnest figure by temperament. He had a dry, sometimes acerbic wit that made him a delight in public appearances and a formidable opponent in political debate. He was not the type to deliver lengthy moralizing speeches about guilt and responsibility. He preferred the pointed remark, the precise observation, the argument that combined intellectual rigor with a certain wry awareness of the absurdities of political life. But beneath the wit was a genuine and deep seriousness about what had happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945, and what Germany owed to the truth about those years. He spoke about his father often, but he spoke about him with a nuance that distinguished his account from both the defensive mythologizing of those who wanted Rommel to be simply a hero, and the reductive condemnation of those who wanted him to be simply another Wehrmacht criminal. The truth, as Manfred had spent decades establishing it and defending it, was more interesting and more morally significant than either of those positions. His father had been a brilliant military commander who had served a criminal regime while keeping his own conduct largely within the laws of war. His father had come to understand, too late to act effectively, that the regime he served was irredeemably evil. His father had been murdered for that understanding. These were the facts as Manfred believed them to be, and he stated them clearly and consistently, invited challenge, engaged with the challenges, and maintained his position on the basis of evidence and argument rather than sentiment. The relationship between Manfred and David Montgomery was perhaps the most publicly visible expression of this approach. Their friendship became, over the years, a kind of living monument to the proposition that the children of the war's participants could build something better from the wreckage than their parents had left. They appeared together at commemorations in North Africa, in Britain, and in Germany. They spoke together to audiences of veterans, politicians, students, and journalists. They modelled a kind of honest engagement with history that required neither the erasure of what had happened, nor its endless rehearsal as grievance and accusation, but instead its active processing as the shared material of a European civilization that had narrowly destroyed itself and was still, decade by decade, building something better from the ruins. Their friendship was genuine, not performed, and it was the most eloquent single argument Manfred ever made for the position that honour and reconciliation were not mutually exclusive, that acknowledging the full truth of the past was the necessary condition of building a trustworthy future. David Montgomery, the second Viscount Montgomery, had his own complex inheritance to manage. His father, Bernard Montgomery, was one of the great British commanders of the Second World War. the general who had finally beaten Rommel at El Alamein and then pursued his retreating forces across Libya and into Tunisia, the man who had commanded the Allied ground forces in the crucial early phases of the Normandy campaign. Montgomery had been a complicated figure in life. Brilliant, infuriating, egotistical, brilliant, difficult, and often wrong about things he was utterly convinced he was right about. His public legacy in Britain was the victory at El Alamein and the rehabilitation of the Eighth Army after a series of humiliating defeats. But his private legacy was more complicated, involving professional disputes with American commanders like Eisenhower and Patton, questionable strategic decisions in Normandy and at Arnhem, and a relentless self-promotion that made him one of the most argued-about figures in British military history. David Montgomery had to navigate this inheritance just as Manfred had to navigate his own, and their shared experience of managing the complicated memories of great and flawed fathers gave them a genuine, mutual understanding that sustained their friendship across the years. The specific event that cemented their public partnership was the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Battle of El Alamein in 1982. Both men attended, and they appeared together in photographs and on television, the son of the German commander and the son of the British commander standing side by side at the place where their fathers' armies had fought with such ferocity 4 decades earlier. It was a profoundly moving image, and it was covered extensively in the British and German press as a symbol of how far the two countries had come from the enmity of the wartime years. But it was not merely a symbolic gesture. Both men spoke at the commemoration about what the battle had meant, about what it had cost, about what they felt standing on that ground, their willingness to engage honestly with the meaning of what had happened there, to acknowledge the valour and suffering on both sides without eliding the difference between the causes those sides had served, exemplified the kind of historical engagement that Manfred had been practising his entire adult life. The post-war careers of the German field marshals, who had been Rommel's contemporaries and equals, provided a further backdrop against which his story and his son's story acquired additional meaning. Erwin Rommel was not the only senior German commander to face the question of what a professional soldier owed to the political cause he served. He was simply the most famous and the one whose answer to that question was most clearly purchased with his own life. Consider the case of Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior field marshal of the Wehrmacht, the man who had delivered Rommel's funeral oration without giving any indication that he knew the truth of how Rommel had died. Rundstedt was a Prussian of the old school, a career soldier who had served in the Kaiser's army, the Weimar army, and finally Hitler's army without any particular ideological investment in any of them. He regarded himself as a professional servant of the state, whatever form the state took. This attitude insulated him from the worst of the regime's crimes in the sense that he never volunteered for the ideological crusades that characterized the SS and the Eastern Front's most brutal commanders, but it also meant he never found the moral clarity to refuse or resist. He ended the war under British arrest, was charged with war crimes related to his assistance with a criminal order issued by Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau that had led to mass murders in occupied Soviet territory, and was ultimately released in July 1948 due to his advanced age and deteriorating health. He died in February 1953 in Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, never having been brought to trial for the actions he had taken in service to the Reich, his long life ending with the same professional impassivity with which it had been conducted. The contrast between Rundstedt's comfortable, if obscure, retirement and the judicial fates of men like Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel illuminated the arbitrary quality of post-war justice as applied to the Wehrmacht's senior leadership. Jodl, who had served as chief of the operations staff of the OKW, the German High Command, throughout the war and had signed or forwarded many of the most criminally significant orders of the conflict, was tried at Nuremberg and found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment. He was hanged on October 16, 1946. His final words were, "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," which translates as, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." It was a defiant end from a man who had maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, arguing that he had been a soldier carrying out his duties, not a criminal. The court found that argument insufficient given the scope and deliberateness of the orders he had issued. Keitel, Hitler's military chief of staff and one of his most obedient loyalists, was also hanged on the same day. Unlike Jodl, Keitel had actually accepted responsibility for his actions at trial, acknowledging that he bore responsibility for the outcomes of his signed orders. This unusual admission of culpability did nothing to save him. The men who survived, who went to prison and were released, who were never tried at all, illustrated how dependent post-war accountability had been on the specific nature of the charges that could be assembled and on the physical health of the accused. Walter von Brauchitsch, the former commander-in-chief of the German army who had overseen the critical, early campaigns of the war, died of pneumonia in October 1948, just as he was about to be brought to trial, escaping accountability by the most random of biological contingencies. Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as the Wehrmacht's most gifted strategic thinker, was tried by a British military court and convicted of war crimes, but was released in 1953 due to health issues and went on to serve as an advisor to the West German government on army organization and to publish his memoirs, Wöhlerin Siege, Lost Victories, which became one of the most influential military memoirs of the 20th century. Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe field marshal who had commanded in Italy and ordered the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Caves massacre in March 1944, was initially sentenced to death, had that sentence commuted to life imprisonment, and was then pardoned and released in 1952, after which he became involved in veterans associations, and continued to exercise a degree of public influence before his death in 1960. None of these outcomes satisfied the demands of justice in any pure sense. They were compromises, products of political calculations, medical considerations, and the practical limitations of post-war judicial machinery operating under enormous caseloads and political pressure. It was against this morally ambiguous landscape of partial justice and partial amnesia that Manfred Rommel was making his arguments about his father's specific case. He was not claiming that the Wehrmacht had been blameless, or that Germany's professional soldiers bore no responsibility for the crimes committed under German military authority. He was making a more specific and more defensible claim that Erwin Rommel personally, and the Afrika Korps operationally, had maintained a standard of conduct that distinguished them from other German military formations in other theatres, that this distinction was historically documented and morally significant, and that Erwin Rommel's murder at Hitler's orders was itself a piece of evidence supporting the claim that he had, in the end, chosen conscience over complicity. This was an argument that could be evaluated on the basis of historical evidence. It was not a blank check of exoneration for everything his father had done or failed to do. It was a specific claim about specific facts, and Manfred defended it in that specific way. What made Manfred's advocacy effective over time was precisely this combination of specificity, honesty, and willingness to engage with the counter-arguments. He was not asking history to be kind to his father. He was asking history to be accurate. There is a difference. And in making that argument repeatedly, publicly, over decades, he gradually shaped the way Erwin Rommel was understood in the German and international historical literature in a way that a less honest or less patient advocate could not have achieved. The Rommel who exists in historical memory today, and who was the subject of a major new German historical reassessment in the early 21st century, is a more nuanced figure than the simple hero of German wartime propaganda and the equally simple villain of certain post-war revisionism. He is a man of genuine and great military gifts who served a criminal regime, who kept his own conduct largely within the laws of war in the theatre where he fought, who understood too late what his service had meant, and was making his way, imperfectly and ambiguously, toward the right side when the regime murdered him. That picture is not perfect for anyone. It is not comfortable. It requires holding multiple things in mind simultaneously. But it is, by the best available evidence, the most accurate picture of who Erwin Rommel actually was. And getting to that picture took decades of work by a man who had watched his father drive away to his death at 15 years old and had decided in that moment that he would spend the rest of his life making sure the world knew what had really happened. Manfred Rommel's health began to fail in his later years. He suffered from a series of illnesses that progressively limited his public activities in the years following his retirement from the mayoralty in 1996. He had given a great deal of himself to Stuttgart and to the project of historical truth-telling, and the physical costs of that sustained engagement were evident in his final decade. He continued, however, to grant interviews, to correspond with historians, and to speak publicly on occasions that mattered to him. He remained a figure of significant moral authority in German public life well into his 80s, a man whose opinions on questions of historical memory and democratic responsibility were sought and listened to. He had outlived many of his contemporaries among the children of the Nazi leadership, had outlived some of the controversies that had defined his public life, and had seen his father's reputation settled, at least in the mainstream of German historical scholarship, on a foundation that he judged to be essentially fair. Not perfect, not the heroic legend the Wehrmacht propaganda machine had constructed, but fair. He also outlived by a few years a significant and painful development in the scholarly reassessment of Erwin Rommel's legacy. In 2009, a German historian named Ralf Georg Reuth published a major new biography of Rommel that challenged the resistance narrative more directly than most previous scholarship had done, arguing that Rommel's connection to the July 20th plotters had been more peripheral and more reluctant than the dominant post-war account suggested, and that his engagement with the conspiracy had been motivated primarily by a desire to manage the terms of Germany's military defeat, rather than by any genuine moral rejection of the Nazi regime. This argument, and the broader scholarly conversation it entered, required Manfred to engage once more with the central question of his father's historical identity, and he did so with the same methodical determination he had always brought to the subject. He disputed Ruth's conclusions on specific evidentiary grounds, maintained his own interpretation of the available facts, and insisted, as he always had, that the one piece of evidence that could not be explained away by any counter-narrative was the cyanide capsule, the state funeral, and the lie that killed his father. Whatever Erwin Rommel had or had not done before October 14th, 1944, the regime had murdered him. That fact, Manfred argued, with the same force and clarity he had been bringing to the argument for 6 decades, spoke for itself. Manfred Rommel died on November 7, 2013, in Stuttgart. He was 84 years old. He had served as Lord Mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years, had been one of the most prominent figures in West German and unified German civic life for nearly half a century, and had made of his father's story and his own a remarkable and improbable narrative of persistence, democracy, and the possibility of honour in a world that had done its best to extinguish it. The tributes that came after his death were numerous and sincere, from Germany and from Britain, from former colleagues and from political opponents, from historians and from ordinary citizens who had followed his career. David Montgomery, Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, was among those who expressed condolences publicly. The son of the general who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein mourned the death of the son of the general who had been his father's greatest adversary, and in that mourning expressed something that went well beyond sentiment. It was a statement about what the post-war European project had been able to build on the wreckage of the war, about the possibility of genuine friendship between former enemies, about the power of honest engagement with history to create something more lasting than the grievances it dissolves. The city of Stuttgart honoured Manfred Rommel with tributes that reflected the full scope of what he had meant to the city and to Germany. Streets were named, memorials were placed, and obituaries filled with the specific details of his administrative achievements and his moral courage. But perhaps the most telling tribute was the simple fact that the city he had led for 22 years was, by any objective measure, better for his having led it, not just physically and economically, but in the quality of its civic culture, its willingness to engage honestly with its own history, and its confidence in democratic values as something worth defending and worth investing in. That was what Manfred Rommel had spent his life building in Stuttgart and in German public life more broadly. It was, in its quiet and persistent and thoroughly civilian way, the most effective kind of revenge imaginable against a regime that had murdered his father with poison and lies. The question of what to make of Erwin Rommel, the military commander and the man, is not fully settled by the existence of a good son. Manfred's advocacy was honest, but advocacy is not history. And even the most scrupulously fair-minded advocate has blind spots created by love. The scholarship on Rommel continues to evolve, and it continues to find both more and less in his story than the clean narrative of the resistance hero that the post-war German memory machine found convenient. The most recent serious assessments, drawing on archival sources opened in the decades since the war, paint a picture of a man who was more fully embedded in the Nazi system than the desert legend suggested, who received personal financial gifts from Hitler that made him materially dependent on the regime's favour, who did not speak out against crimes he had at least partial knowledge of, and who came to opposition late, and by the time he acted, too late to matter. These are uncomfortable facts for anyone who wants Rommel to be simply heroic, but they are not the whole picture either. The documented conduct of the Afrika Korps in the field, the consistent testimony of British prisoners, the absence of any credible evidence that Rommel ordered or condoned atrocities against civilians or against prisoners of war, the documented opposition to certain criminal orders that reached his command, and above all the fact of his murder and the regime's evident fear of what he represented, all of this speaks to something real and something honourable in the man, even if that something was imperfect and came too slowly and was never tested in the way it would have been, had he survived to face the full reckoning of the post-war world. Rommel died before anyone could ask him what he had known, what he had done, what he had not done, and should have. That absence is part of what makes his story so endlessly contested and so endlessly compelling. What is not contested is what his son made of the inheritance. Manfred Rommel was given a devastated family, a murdered father, a name that could have been an anchor dragging him under or a sail that drove him forward, and he chose to make it a sail. He became, over the course of his long and productive life, a genuinely important figure in the political and moral recovery of his country. He did this not by forgetting what had been done or by pretending that it had not been done, but by engaging with it directly, honestly, and with the consistent conviction that honesty was not just the right approach, but the effective one. He proved, over more than half a century of public life, that it is possible for a country to acknowledge the worst of its history and still build something worth having from what remains. He proved that the children of even the most complicated moral legacies can choose something better than denial or despair. And he proved, perhaps most movingly, that the enemies of a previous generation need not remain the enemies of the next, that the handshake between a German mayor and a British viscount at the graves of their father's soldiers in the North African desert was worth more in the long run than any tactical victory either of those fathers had ever won. Erwin Rommel drove away from Herrlingen on October 14, 1944, in the back of a car in the last 30 minutes of his life, and his 15-year-old son watched from the doorway. What Manfred Rommel did with the rest of his life was the answer he gave to that image. Not violence, not hatred, not the bitter grievance that would have been so understandable and so corrosive, but democracy, civic responsibility, honest engagement with history, and the extraordinary symbolic power of a reconciliation freely offered and freely received. It was a form of courage as demanding in its own way as anything his father had shown in the deserts of North Africa. It was in the fullest sense of the word the revenge of a good man against a regime that had bet on evil and found that it was not enough to kill the truth along with the man who carried it. The legacy that Manfred Rommel left behind in Stuttgart and in German public memory is, at its core, a reminder of what individual moral agency can accomplish even within the most constrained and damaged of historical circumstances. He had no army, no tanks, no panzer divisions at his back. He had a law degree, a political party membership, the force of his own intelligence and character, and the story of a father who had been given a choice and made the right one, even at the cost of his life. From those materials he built something remarkable, not a monument to denial, not an exoneration of crimes that were committed, not a comfortable myth for a country that needed comfortable myths. Something harder and more valuable, a demonstration that honesty, persistence, and the willingness to hold complexity without flinching could, over time, produce a reckoning that served truth rather than concealing it. That was Manfred's revenge. And it lasted. When you look at all the children of the Nazi leadership together, when you map the full range of their choices and their fates, what emerges is not a simple moral tale, but a complicated and deeply human one. They were born into circumstances they did not choose, bearing names they could not change, the children of men who had done things that ranged from the morally ambiguous to the catastrophically evil. Some of them chose loyalty, doubling down on their father's choices in ways that perpetuated the harm those choices had already done. Some chose silence, retreating from history's demands into private lives where the questions could not quite reach them. Some chose condemnation, burning their inheritances publicly and at great personal cost. And some, like Manfred Rommel, chose engagement, the hard, slow, unglamorous work of insisting on accuracy, defending distinction, building friendship with former enemies, and using the platform of democratic public life to demonstrate that the worst chapters of a nation's history need not determine its future character. The world that these children navigated was not one that made those choices easy. Post-war Germany was a country in ruins, physical and moral, trying to rebuild itself from materials contaminated by 12 years of totalitarian rule and the crimes of a regime that had managed to recruit virtually every institution of German society into its service. The denazification programs were imperfect, the trials were partial, the justice delivered was never proportionate to the crimes committed, and the pressures of Cold War politics had created powerful incentives to look forward rather than backward, to integrate former participants in the regime into the structures of the new democratic state, rather than to pursue accountability at the cost of political stability. In this environment, the children of the Nazi leadership occupied a peculiar position. Too young to have been legally culpable for their father's crimes, old enough to have been shaped by them and left to work out for themselves what responsibility, if any, they bore for what had been done in the names they carried. Manfred Rommel's answer to that question was characteristic, precise, honest, and rooted in a clear-eyed assessment of the evidence. He bore no legal responsibility for his father's actions. He bore a historical and moral responsibility to ensure that those actions were accurately understood and appropriately contextualized. He bore a civic responsibility, which he had voluntarily assumed by entering public life, to model the kind of honest engagement with Germany's past that the country's democratic future required. And he bore a personal responsibility to his father's memory that was, in his view, best honoured not by mythologizing Erwin Rommel into a simple hero, but by insisting on the full, complicated, imperfect truth of who he was and what he had chosen at the end of his life. In discharging those responsibilities over more than 6 decades of active public life, Manfred Rommel accomplished something that very few sons of very famous fathers ever manage. He built an independent legacy of his own, one that stood on its own merits and its own achievements that would have been remarkable even if his father had been a completely unknown man. The 22 years as Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, the friendship with David Montgomery that became a symbol of European reconciliation, the decades of historical advocacy conducted with scholarly rigour and personal integrity, the consistent modelling of democratic values in a country that was still, at some level, arguing about whether democracy was a genuine German commitment or a temporary foreign imposition, all of this added up to a life of genuine and lasting significance. He was not just Erwin Rommel's son. He was Manfred Rommel, and what Manfred Rommel was and did and chose was entirely his own. Germany has changed enormously since the boy in the doorway at Herrlingen watched his father's car disappear around the bend in the road. The Germany of 2024 is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most stable and successful democracies in the world, a country that has done more than perhaps any other nation in history to publicly acknowledge and take responsibility for the crimes of its recent past, that has built Holocaust memorials at the centre of its capital, that has integrated the education of that history into every level of its school curriculum, and that has maintained across multiple governments and political generations a commitment to the proposition that the memory of the worst cannot be allowed to fade. That transformation was not achieved by any single person or any single act. It was the product of millions of individual choices made across decades by ordinary Germans who had to decide, each in their own way, what their country was going to be. Manfred Rommel was not just a witness to that transformation. He was one of its architects, using the particular materials of his particular inheritance to build a particular piece of the foundation that the new Germany rested on. The revenge he planned for his father's killers was, in the end, the simple, durable, irreversible revenge of a country that chose truth over lies, law over violence, and democracy over everything that had tried to destroy it. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this story as fascinating and as moving as we do, because at its heart it is not just a story about war or generals or the Third Reich, but about something more universal and more enduring. The choices that individuals make when history puts everything in the balance, and what those choices mean for the generations that come after. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our other content covering the extraordinary stories of World War II and the people who lived through it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos on World War II history. See you in the next one. But to leave the story there at its natural conclusion would be to omit some of the richest historical texture that surrounds it. The story of Erwin Rommel and his son Manfred cannot be fully appreciated without a deeper look at the specific military context in which Erwin made his reputation and the specific post-war context in which Manfred made his. Each of those contexts contained layers of complexity that the broad strokes of the narrative can only hint at, and each rewards the closer examination that the story demands. Consider the question of Rommel's relationship with the Jewish soldiers who served in the British Eighth Army and the armies of the Commonwealth. The German forces in North Africa operated under standing orders from the OKW, the German High Command, that Jewish soldiers captured from. Enemy forces were to be identified and handed over to the SS for special treatment, which in practice meant death. These orders were, by the documented testimony of surviving witnesses and by the absence of any documented complaint from Jewish veterans who had been captured by the Afrika Korps, consistently ignored by Rommel's command. Jewish soldiers captured by the Afrika Korps were treated as ordinary prisoners of war, held in the same camps as their non-Jewish comrades, given the same conditions and the same treatment. This was not a universal practice across the German military in other theatres. In the occupied East, where the SS Einsatzgruppen operated in close coordination with army group commands, the identification and murder of Jewish prisoners was routine. That Rommel's army did not participate in this particular crime when it had the opportunity and the explicit order to do so is a documented fact, and it is one of the specific pieces of evidence that Manfred Rommel cited. In his decades of advocacy for his father's reputation, it does not make Erwin Rommel a saint, and it doesn't erase the fact that he served a regime that was committing those murders elsewhere, but it distinguishes him from those who did participate, and that distinction matters for historical accuracy, even if it cannot be allowed to do too much moral work. The specific geography of the North African campaign also contributed to the conditions that allowed the Afrika Korps to maintain its relatively clean record in the theatre. The Western Desert was vast, sparsely populated, and largely uninhabited by civilian populations of the kind that became targets of German military violence in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and the Balkans. There were no large Jewish communities in the Libyan and Egyptian desert that German forces were advancing through. There was no partisan resistance of the kind that German commanders in Yugoslavia and Greece used as justification for mass reprisals against civilian populations. The circumstances of desert warfare were, in this specific sense, simpler morally than the circumstances of occupied Europe, and it would be wrong to attribute too much of the Afrika Korps' relatively good conduct to the personal ethics of its commander when the theatre's circumstances remove many of the temptations and opportunities that produce the worst crimes elsewhere. Manfred Rommel was aware of this argument and engaged with it honestly, acknowledging that the specific circumstances of the Desert Campaign made it easier to maintain lawful conduct than it would have been in other theatres, while still insisting that the specific choices made by his father and his father's command added up to something meaningful about the character of the man. The contrast between Rommel's conduct in North Africa and the documented conduct of German forces in the Balkans and the Soviet Union was brought into sharp relief by the post-war trials of German commanders who had served in those theatres. The cases of Georg von Küchler and Wilhelm List, both of whom faced trial for crimes committed in their respective theatres, illustrated the systemic nature of the German military's involvement in atrocities outside the theatre where Rommel had commanded. Küchler, who had commanded Army Group North in the Soviet Union and whose forces had cooperated closely with the SS Einsatzgruppen, responsible for mass executions, received a 20-year sentence at the High Command trial, later reduced to 12 years, and was released in February 1953. His attempts during the trial to minimize his personal responsibility for the atrocities committed under his command, attributing the harsh conditions in prisoner of war camps to winter weather rather than deliberate policy, were characteristic of the defensive posture most German commanders adopted before Allied tribunals. The court was not persuaded. His conviction represented a finding that a commanding officer's legal and moral responsibility for the conduct of forces under his command is not negated by the delegation of operational details to subordinates, a principle that the Nuremberg prosecutors had established as fundamental to the entire project of post-war accountability. Wilhelm List's case was similarly instructive. List had commanded German forces in the Balkans and was tried in the hostages trial at Nuremberg, where he faced charges related to the brutal reprisals against civilian populations in Yugoslavia and Greece that had characterized German occupation policy in those countries. The German military in the Balkans had operated under orders that mandated the shooting of large numbers of civilian hostages in retaliation for attacks by partisan forces, a policy that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. List was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he was released in 1953 due to ill health and then lived for another 19 years, dying in 1971 at the age of 91. His case, like Küchler's, established that senior commanders could not insulate themselves from legal responsibility for systematic crimes by claiming ignorance or by pointing to orders from higher authority. These precedents were central to the entire edifice of international humanitarian law that emerged from the Nuremberg trials and that continues to govern the conduct of warfare to the present day. Against this backdrop of systematic institutional violence in the Wehrmacht's Eastern and Balkan theatres, the specific character of Rommel's Afrika Korps appeared all the more distinctive, and Manfred Rommel's advocacy for that distinction appeared all the more grounded in real historical differentiation rather than merely filial sentiment. What Manfred was arguing was not that the German military had been clean or honourable as a whole. He knew very well that it had not been. He was arguing for a distinction between the general case and the specific case between the systemic crimes of German military occupation in Europe and the specific conduct of one formation in one theatre under one commander. This was an argument that required precision to make and precision to evaluate, and Manfred made it with precision over and over again for 60 years. The role that the German general's post-war memoirs played in shaping the collective memory of the Wehrmacht deserves attention in this context because it was not a neutral or disinterested process. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the 1950s and 1960s, a series of major memoirs by surviving German commanders, including Manstein's Verloren Siege, Kesselring's memoir and Guderian's Panzer Leader, created a widely read and influential literature that collectively advanced what historians have called the clean Wehrmacht myth, the argument that the professional German military had fought a conventional war of soldiers against soldiers, that the atrocities of the occupation were primarily the work of the SS and the Nazi political apparatus rather than the military, and that the generals had often tried to limit the political interference in military operations that made those atrocities possible. This literature was not entirely fabricated. There was a genuine distinction between the SS and many regular Wehrmacht formations, and there were individual commanders who did resist or subvert criminal orders. But the literature systematically understated the extent to which the Wehrmacht as an institution had been complicit in the Holocaust and in the broader crimes of German occupation, and it served the political purpose of rehabilitating the image of German military professionalism in the eyes of a Western audience that was beginning to want West Germany as an ally in the Cold War, and needed to believe that German military tradition could be trusted. Manfred Rommel navigated this literature with some care. He did not simply absorb its arguments wholesale. His advocacy for his father was based on specific documented evidence rather than on the general claim that the Wehrmacht had been clean. He knew that the general claim was false, even if specific aspects of it had genuine historical basis. His project was precisely the specific one of documenting and defending Erwin Rommel's particular case, and he was scrupulous about not extending that defense to German military conduct generally. This scrupulousness was itself part of what made his advocacy credible to serious historians. He was not asking them to accept a convenient fiction about the Wehrmacht. He was asking them to evaluate the specific evidence about the specific man, and to make their judgments on that specific basis. The memorials and commemorations that Manfred attended over the decades of his public life were not only in Germany and North Africa. He visited Britain multiple times, participated in events organised by veterans organisations on both sides of the wartime divide, and consistently used those occasions to speak about the shared experience of soldiers on both sides and the possibility of building mutual respect across the divide of former enmity. He was received in Britain with a warmth that reflected the genuine respect that many British veterans and military historians had for his father's military gifts and his personal manner of conducting the war, and he reciprocated that warmth with the genuine appreciation of a man who understood what it meant for former enemies to extend such generosity. The relationship between Germany and Britain in the post-war decades was complex and sometimes difficult, marked by the specific weight of German crimes against British civilians during the Blitz, by the memory of the Dunkirk evacuation, and by the slower and more gradual process of economic and political integration that was eventually subsumed into the broader European project. Manfred Rommel was one of the German figures who contributed, through his personal diplomacy and his public presence, to making that relationship warmer and more trusting than it might otherwise have been. The specific commemoration at El Alamein in 1982, the 40th anniversary of the battle, was organised with considerable logistical complexity and diplomatic sensitivity. El Alamein is in Egypt, a country that had been the prize both armies had been fighting to control 40 years earlier, and the Egyptian government's cooperation in allowing the commemoration to proceed with full dignity for both sides reflected the extent to which the battle had become, in the 4 decades since it was fought, a piece of world military history rather than a live political controversy. The graves of the soldiers who died there, German, Italian, British, Australian, New Zealander, South African, Indian and others, are maintained by their respective governments' war graves commissions to this day, a physical testament to the scale of what happened in that desert over 3 years of fighting. Manfred Rommel walked among those graves in 1982 alongside David Montgomery, and what he felt in that place, surrounded by the physical evidence of what his father's campaign had cost in human life on both sides, can only be imagined. He spoke publicly about it with characteristic restraint and precision, avoiding both sentimentality and false heroics, acknowledging the cost, honouring the courage on both sides, and insisting on the lesson that military virtue and political cause are separable, that men can fight with honour for a dishonourable master, and that the honour of the soldier does not redeem the crime of the regime, but neither is it erased by that crime. The question of whether the North African campaign had any counterfactual significance, whether Rommel's victory at El Alamein, if it had happened, would have changed the course of the war, is one that military historians have debated extensively. Had Rommel broken through to Cairo and Alexandria and reached the Suez Canal, the strategic implications would have been enormous. The disruption of British supply lines through the Red Sea, the potential collapse of Britain's position in the Middle East, the possibility of German forces linking up with those advancing through the Caucasus from the north. Some historians argue that a Rommel victory in Egypt could have fundamentally altered the balance of the war. Others point to the logistical impossibility of sustaining such an advance given the state of Rommel's forces and the growing Allied superiority in the air and at sea, and argue that even a tactical victory at El Alamein would not have produced the strategic result Rommel dreamed of. The debate is genuinely unresolvable because history does not allow controlled experiments, but its terms illuminate something about what was at stake in those months of fighting in the desert, and why the battle that finally stopped Rommel has retained such a prominent place in military memory on both sides. What is not counterfactual is what actually happened. Rommel was defeated, his army was destroyed, his dream of an African empire for the 1,000-year Reich was extinguished in the sand, and the tide of the war turned against Germany in a way that was never subsequently reversed. The El Alamein commemoration of 1982 was an acknowledgement of that historical reality, a joint recognition by the sons of the opposing commanders that the battle had been real and consequential and costly, and that the men who fought it on both sides had done so with the courage and the suffering that warfare demands. Manfred stood at those graves and embodied, with his presence there, the proposition that acknowledging the reality of defeat is not dishonour, that the memory of men who fought and died does not require the falsification of the battle's outcome, and that the capacity to stand with your father's former enemy at the place where they faced each other and say, "Together this happened and it mattered and we are still here, building something better," is itself a form of victory over the forces that made the war necessary in the first place. The story of the Rommel family does not end with Manfred's death in 2013, though he was the last direct link to the immediate wartime generation. Erwin Rommel's memory has continued to be a subject of active historical debate in Germany and internationally, with each generation of historians approaching it with new questions, new archival access, and new analytical frameworks. The debate about whether the resistance narrative is accurate, about whether the Western Desert myth of chivalric warfare accurately represents what actually happened in North Africa, and about whether Rommel's treatment of his African subjects, particularly the populations of Libya and Egypt, was as honourable as the treatment of his British prisoners, continues to produce new scholarship and new arguments. A 2021 German television documentary that re-examined Rommel's legacy attracted enormous public attention in Germany, suggesting that the question of how to remember him remains alive and significant for contemporary Germans in a way that few other Second World War figures can match. The persistence of the debate is itself a tribute of sorts to what Manfred Rommel accomplished. A historical figure whose reputation was simply and straightforwardly heroic or simply and straightforwardly villainous would not produce the kind of sustained, serious and contested scholarly engagement that Erwin Rommel has generated across 8 decades of historical writing. It is precisely because the question is genuinely complicated, because the evidence supports a nuanced and multi-layered assessment rather than a simple verdict, that it continues to attract serious attention. Manfred did not create that complexity. It was intrinsic to his father's story, but he shaped the terms in which it was discussed, insisting always that honest engagement with complexity was the only intellectually respectable approach, and that the quest for an accurate, complete, and appropriately nuanced account was worth the sustained effort it required. One element of Erwin Rommel's story that deserves particular attention in any full accounting of his career is his relationship with Hitler over the course of the war, because it evolved from genuine mutual admiration into something much darker, and the arc of that evolution is essential to understanding who Erwin Rommel was and what he became. In the early years, the admiration was real. Rommel had been given his first armour command by Hitler's direct personal interest, had been observed at close quarters during the Polish campaign, and impressed the Führer with his energy and his presence, and had been promoted rapidly and given resources and opportunities that his professional standing in the German army might not have justified by the conventional standards of seniority. He received financial gifts from Hitler, including significant sums that supplemented his salary and helped him to live in a style appropriate to his growing status. He was, by any objective assessment, a beneficiary of Hitler's patronage in ways that created a real material dependency on the regime's continued favour. The gratitude and the admiration were genuine in the early years, but they were built on a foundation of military success that the conditions of the war were steadily eroding. As the Afrika Korps ran short of supplies, as Hitler's promises of reinforcement went unfulfilled, as the Luftwaffe and the Italian Navy proved unable to secure the sea lanes that kept his army alive, as the strategic position in North Africa deteriorated from promising to untenable, Rommel's communications with Hitler became increasingly desperate and increasingly unheeded. He sent his aide-de-camp to Hitler personally to argue for evacuation when Tunisia was clearly lost, and he was refused, and he was replaced in command without being consulted. He was sent to command the Atlantic Wall defences with assurances of resources and authority that were never fully delivered, and when he argued with Rundstedt for the kind of defensive strategy that he believed gave Germany its best chance of containing the Allied invasion, he was overruled in favour of a compromise that satisfied nobody and worked for nobody. The professional relationship between Rommel and Hitler in 1944 was not the relationship of a trusted commander and a grateful patron. It was the relationship of a man who had come to understand that the patron's judgment was catastrophically flawed, and the patron's word could not be trusted, trying to manage the consequences of that understanding while still holding a command that the patron controlled. Into this deteriorating professional relationship came the growing awareness of what was actually happening in the occupied territories in the East, in the concentration camps whose existence was an open secret among the military leadership by the middle years of the war. Rommel's aides have testified that he was not a man who sought out this knowledge, who wanted to know the full dimensions of what was being done in Germany's name. He was a soldier, not a politician, and the specific intelligence about the mechanics of genocide was not something he pursued, but the general knowledge that something monstrous was happening, that the regime was not simply prosecuting a war but was engaged in a systematic project of murder on an industrial scale, was available to any senior officer who chose to attend to it. Whether Rommel attended to it, when he attended to it, and what he felt when he did are questions that cannot be answered with certainty from the available evidence. What can be said is that by 1944 he was in contact with men who had attended to it very carefully and who were prepared to act on what they knew, and that his contacts, with those men represented, at minimum, a willingness to be in proximity to the resistance, even if his own commitment to it was ambiguous and incomplete. The specific nature of Rommel's involvement in the July 20th plot is worth examining in some detail, because it is central to the resistance narrative that Manfred Rommel spent decades defending and that remains contested in the historical literature. The plotters centered around Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg had been in contact through intermediaries with a number of senior Wehrmacht commanders in the spring and summer of 1944, seeking both active support for the planned coup and assurances from regional commanders that their forces would comply with the conspirators' orders if the attempt succeeded. Among those who were approached, and who did not immediately denounce the approach to the Gestapo, were several officers on Rommel's staff, including Lieutenant Colonel Cäsar von Hoffacker, a cousin of Stauffenberg's who served in Paris and maintained close contact with Rommel's headquarters. The evidence that Rommel was directly told about the specific plan to assassinate Hitler is thin and contested. The evidence that he was told about a general plan to remove Hitler from power by some means, and that he was asked whether he would be prepared to serve in a new government, or at least to cooperate with one, is stronger. Rommel's recorded response to these approaches, as reported by those who were present at the conversations, was characteristically pragmatic. He believed Hitler's removal was necessary. He believed the war was lost and Germany needed to negotiate a peace. But he was skeptical about the assassination specifically, fearing that it would create a martyrdom around Hitler that would make the political situation worse rather than better. He reportedly said that he thought it would be enough to arrest Hitler and put him on trial rather than kill him. Whether this reflected a genuine moral scruple against political murder, a pragmatic judgment about the political consequences, or simply a caution about being too directly associated with an operation that might fail, is impossible to determine from the available evidence. What is clear is that he did not denounce the men who approached him. In a police state where the penalty for knowledge of treason without denunciation was death, that inaction was itself a form of complicity, and, arguably, a form of courage. After the plot failed on July 20th, 1944, and the Gestapo's interrogations extracted the names of those who had been contacted, Rommel's name appeared in several testimonies as someone who had been sympathetic to the plotters' aims, if not their specific methods. The regime's decision to offer him the choice of suicide rather than trial reflected its assessment that the political damage of a public trial of Germany's most celebrated general would exceed the political benefit of publicly executing him. This calculation was itself a confession. The regime was afraid of what a trial might reveal about the extent of military opposition within the Wehrmacht, afraid of the effect on troop morale of watching Rommel in the dock, and afraid of what Rommel himself might say if given a public platform. The cyanide capsule was the regime's admission of its own vulnerability, and Manfred Rommel for 60 years made sure that admission was not forgotten. The final measure of what Manfred Rommel accomplished in his long life of public service is perhaps best assessed not by the monuments and memorials, but by the changed quality of the conversation about his father that his advocacy made possible. Before Manfred, the public discourse about Erwin Rommel tended to oscillate between uncritical hero worship, which served the needs of those who wanted a clean Wehrmacht legend, and equally uncritical condemnation, which served the needs of those who wanted no distinctions made within the category of German military service. Manfred forced a third position, the honest assessment grounded in specific evidence that acknowledged both the genuine military excellence and the genuine moral ambiguity of his father's career. This third position was more demanding to hold than either of the simple ones. It required keeping multiple things in mind simultaneously: the brilliance of the military commander and the crimes of the regime he served, the relative cleanliness of the Afrika Korps, and the systemic evil of the war it was part of, the courage of the man who chose the cyanide capsule, and the long shadow of the years he had served the regime that forced that choice upon him. Holding those things together, refusing to collapse them into a simpler and more comfortable story, was itself a moral and intellectual achievement, And it was an achievement that Manfred Rommel made possible not just for himself, but for every historian and every reader and every schoolchild who subsequently engaged with the question of who Erwin Rommel was. The children of the war, both those who grew up in Germany and those who grew up among Germany's former enemies, carried the weight of what their parents' generation had done in ways that were both similar and profoundly different. In Britain, France, the Soviet Union, Poland, and the other nations that had fought and suffered at Germany's hands, the children of the wartime generation carried grief, trauma, and in some cases the specific burden of survival when so many others had not survived. In Germany, the children of the perpetrators' generation carried something that had no clean name in any language. Not quite guilt, because they had not chosen what their parents had done. Not quite innocence, because the circumstances of their privileged childhoods had been purchased with other people's suffering. Not quite shame, because shame requires a conscious acknowledgement that many of them, at least in the early post-war years, had not yet arrived at. And not quite freedom, because the names they bore and the families they came from were facts that could not be unfactored from who they were and what they could become. They had to find their own way through this landscape without maps, with only their own characters and choices to guide them. Some found it through loyalty, some through denial, some through condemnation, some through silence, and some, like Manfred Rommel, through the long and demanding work of honest engagement with a complicated truth. The Germany that Manfred Rommel served as mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years was not a perfect country. No country is. But it was, by the time of his retirement in 1996, a country that had done more than most to reckon honestly with its past, to build the institutional structures of accountability and memory that make it harder for the worst to happen again, and to integrate that reckoning into the foundations of a democratic civic culture that took seriously the lessons of what had happened when democracy had been abandoned. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the education programs in schools, the laws against Holocaust denial, the funding of survivor testimony projects and historical archives, the systematic documentation and commemoration of the victims of National Socialism. All of these were products of a collective decision that Germany's past could not be suppressed or minimized without endangering its democratic future. Manfred Rommel did not create any of these things alone, but he contributed to creating the civic culture that produced and sustained them, and the specific contribution he made, through his personal example and his public advocacy, was to demonstrate that even the most complicated and ambiguous inheritance from that past could be handled with honesty and integrity. The 70 years between October 14th, 1944 and November 7th, 2013 were, in their sweep, one of the most dramatic and consequential periods in human history. They encompassed the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, the decolonization of the European empires, the economic miracle of West Germany's reconstruction, the building of the European community that eventually became the European Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and the emergence of a new kind of European order based on cooperation, common institutions, and shared democratic values. Manfred Rommel lived through all of it, actively engaged with much of it, and contributed to it in ways that were rarely dramatic, but were consistently significant. His long life was a counterexample to the idea that the legacy of the Nazi era was an insuperable obstacle to German participation in the building of a better Europe. He demonstrated, through what he did rather than through what he said about it, that the answer to a father's murder by a totalitarian state was not to become something less than what that state had destroyed, but to become something more. A democrat, a builder, a reconciler, a man who could stand with his father's enemies at the graves of their father's soldiers and say, in the full knowledge of what had brought them there, that this is what a different future looks like. That was the revenge that Manfred Rommel planned for his father's killers. It took 7 decades to complete, and it was, in the end, the only kind of revenge worth having.